full picture in that sense, but also full picture even within the spectrum. It's a bit too easy to look at the situation by just looking at the spectrum currently allocated to broadcasters. Let's look at the complete radio spectrum. And by that, I mean, for instance, of the military side or security side of the spectrum. Because it's not like, you know, we have just one side of it that can be discussed and then the rest is basically immune. And that leads to my third point within this complete look, or look at the full picture. Let's look at the real usage. Because, of course, we have allocated spectrum to many people, but now, what is really being done with it? In other terms, what we have trouble accepting is that bandwidth is being kept idle, it's blocked and not used. And this is the point I wanted to make about the military and security point. I mean, if we have allocated quite a lot of space to these usages and actually it's not used, we should take a hard look at that. And I'm making the parallel with the airways. Basically, until recently, during the Cold War, quite a lot of the airspace was reserved for military use, even though it was not used in a very intensive way. And at some point in time, we took the hard decision to say, okay, we need that airspace for economy, and let's take a fresh look at that. Third point, we still want to make sure that missions of public services are protected. So this is, of course, when we talk about the spectrum, we talk about the economy, but there's an important cultural and political dimension to it. What we don't want is that public actors are squeezed out of the radio wave spectrum, and that we end up with situations where basically we go down in terms of diversity, in terms of pluralism, when looking at the users of that spectrum. So this is really an important attention point for us, because we know and we see in a number of member states that pluralism on the radio waves and political pluralism is really going down to levels that are simply not acceptable. Fourth point, and there I would echo what the British representative said. Indeed, on the one hand, we need stability because, well, when we make technological choices, we can't change them every other day, but we need flexibility. And this is really important. So when I'm saying we should look at real usage, so I have nothing against reserving some spectrum for this or that application, but if we realize after a year, 2 years, that actually implementation is not following, then we should take a fresh look and say, okay, maybe we should allocate that spectrum to other usages. I would also insist here on the need to have flexible allocation also for smaller players. We know that, of course, this is a space where big players, either in terms of service providers or technology providers, are ruling, but maybe we should also make sure that smaller players, SMEs, have an easier access to it. And then my final point, and that reflects on what Mr. De Vreijn said, as well, it's a space where member states have played the dominant role so far, but we also know that most of these applications know no physical boundaries. And especially if we want to really optimize the allocation of usage, and including looking at the military side of it, then of course member states have a key role to play. But we also know that ultimately we need a bigger role for the European institutions into that, because of the borderless nature of this topic. And by that, I'm at 5 minutes. Thank you.
Excellent. I have to say that practically all of the speakers had really fulfilled with the recommendation of the time. So thank you very much, Philippe. So then we can come back in this first round to Mrs. Cosgrave from Digital Europe.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. The recovery will be digital. Europe needs jobs and growth. Jobs and growth will come from global leadership in all technologies of the digital economy. What has been mentioned by our Swedish State Secretary, the feudal analogy, is an important consideration for your deliberations going forward. Europe has had global leadership for GSM. We do not have it guaranteed for the future. The stakes are high, and indeed, they are global. Digital Europe proposes that any European spectrum policy consider the following principles. First and foremost, technology neutrality and service neutrality are cornerstones of good spectrum policies. Secondly, effective spectrum authorization procedures and coordination, including the encouragement of secondary trading of spectrum usage rights, should be adopted by member states. Member states are encouraged to release the 2.6 gigahertz band for mobile communications as quickly as possible, in coordination with non-EU countries. The urgency point made by the member from Sweden is very important when we look at global competition. Considerations on the harmonized use of the 2.3 gigahertz band should start in anticipation of spectrum demand for urban areas. Member states and the Commission are encouraged to implement the provisions for the digital dividend for mobile broadband, thereby delivering capacity to sparsely populated areas. We encourage member states to provide the 800 megahertz band for mobile communications as quickly as possible, and to focus on coordination with non-EU countries for a maximum of economic benefit. Adequate efforts must be made to ensure coexistence with television reception. In the longer term, investigation of regulatory issues around new techniques like cognitive radio technologies as a potential means to flexibly address the use of spectrum white spots should be undertaken. Special, suitable spectrum bands should be identified and usage conditions defined. Finally, more efficient use of spectrum identified for other radio sectors, such as public services and/or military applications, the identification and encouragement of spectrum refarming opportunities from these sectors should all be investigated. Ladies and gentlemen, as members of the European Parliament, you are a very important messengers and vectors back to your home constituencies. We know that spectrum is ultimately under the direct responsibility of the member states. So it is up to the member states to transpose directives into national law and to implement. However, based on our experience, this frequently leads, at worst, to conflicting interpretations and approaches, and in some cases has even hindered pan-European service provision. In fact, it at least leads to different speeds of adoption. Digital Europe is concerned that as member states allow more freedom to market players to decide how spectrum should be used, the risk is high that a fragmented approach will prevent the efficient use of spectrum and thereby potentially negatively impact the achievements of important EU policy objectives, such as the development of the single internal market, the development of competition, the development of innovation and growth, and most importantly, the development of global growth opportunities for our European competencies to be exported around the world. Digital Europe believes there are three elements which are essential to optimize the use of spectrum while maximizing the economic potential of this scarce resource. First, more investment in research and development. Our sector represents 26% of business expenditure on research and development. This is the highest of any sector in the European economy. This should be recognized by members of European Parliament and more research and development investment encouraged. Second, pan-European or indeed global standardization approaches should be continued and encouraged. Third, continued deregulation in order to take advantage of a large marketplace. At the same time, reasonable balance is required to reconcile the many interests at stake and foster a mass market for mobile